So we have not, I believe, as a global policy community, spent enough time to understand that inner challenge I talked about, the relationship of the psyche, to us understanding who we are and how we make decisions for what purpose. But the apparent solutions with which the world is busy, with which it thinks it can take action, is what preoccupies 99% of our energy. Total mismatch. I came to this after about 30 years of working in unsustainable development, engaged with the MDGs and the SDGs, working from the multilateral level in the United Nations.
Hi, my name is Dave, and this is the Light Forest Podcast, a journey of exploration to bring more light into how we live and regenerate our planet. Hello, and welcome to the Light Forest Podcast. This podcast is a space to engage in deep, reflective conversations at the intersection of planetary crisis, inner transformation, and systems change, and explore how we might live and bring about more light forest worlds. In this episode, I'm super delighted to be joined by Dr. Naresh Singh. Naresh holds many titles, and I'll read a few of them. He is a professor and executive dean at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy in India. He is director of the Center for Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy, and co-director of the Center for Legal Empowerment of the Poor. Naresh is a true bridge builder and has walked many a path in the forest. He is a transdisciplinary PhD with more than 3 decades of public policy experience with the UNDP and with the federal government of Canada. He does research and teaches in areas of complexity science, systems thinking, and applied spirituality. Naresh also holds many identities and cultures. He's from Guyana in the Caribbean, but is of Indian descent, and throughout his life has walked many paths. So, Naresh, welcome to Light Forest.
Thanks very much, Dave. Great to be with you.
Awesome. Well, we stand now at the edge of the forest with many paths that I'm really excited to sort of go on with you. We probably won't be able to go on to all of them, but I think maybe the best way to start is to invite you to introduce your framing of wicked public policy problems or wicked problems that need a completely new way of approaching, of thinking about and working with. So I would love if you could bring that framing to us of how you see the major problems that we hold and how we can start to bring about these shifts in our systems.
Right, Dave. So wicked policy problems have been with us for a very long time, but they were not recognized as such. I think largely because of two things. One, we did not have the knowledge and insights to recognize them as such. So we continued to model through and hope that things will resolve themselves. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, these wicked policy problems have intensified, one would say, over the last 4 or 5 decades because of the much greater interconnection among people, ideas, flow of energy and information. The whole globalization process intensified, as we know, for several decades. And so this led to an intensification of these wicked policy problems. So these are the two main things. Academically, the phrase wicked policy problems was introduced into the literature and defined by a couple of researchers, Rittel and Weber, in 1973. And they defined wicked problems as those problems which were intransigent, and they were intransigent or could not be solved. It's not even could not easily be solved, they could not be solved. And the reason was that they had myriad causes as well as multiple possible solutions, but they became complex because the attempt at one kind of a solution could make another one of the causes worse. So that kind of problem is not a difficult problem. It's an insoluble problem in many ways, but still problems that can be tamed was the word they used, so that we could reduce the impact on human well-being, planetary well-being, and so on. So the easier way to understand them maybe is a few examples. And wicked policy problems include the problems of poverty, gender equality, Nowadays, climate change. We all went through a recent pandemic. These are all classic wicked problems or wicked policy problems, which, as you will see, quite easily follow the kind of definition and description that I've just given to you. So we have, for example, 17 SDGs. Each one of those SDGs, those goals, in many ways encapsulate a bunch of wicked policy problems together. And it's no, I don't think, surprise to some of us that we are not going to, as a world, going to achieve them. I would even want to add that they might not have been set up to be achieved as such, but the purpose was really to mobilize resources, people, planning processes, governments, civil society actors to begin to focus their efforts in a more disciplined way to address and at least tame the issues described under each of these goals. So that's where I think the world currently is.
Yeah. So you noted some of the wicked policy problems. You noted poverty, inequality, and perhaps climate is the most recent one of the last couple of decades. What would you say have been some of the attempts then that have shown that despite policy efforts, despite market efforts, despite, let's just say, the best of academia and the best of all our institutions, that have shown ultimately that these problems are perhaps getting worse or perhaps have created new problems. And so we're playing this game of whack-a-mole, which doesn't seem to really get us into the destination that we think we want to head to.
Well, perhaps the classic one is climate change itself as one example. So I have been involved with climate change from 1990. So it's been a while. I attended the Second World Climate Conference, where the world's top scientists in climate work, in meteorology and so on, organized by the World Meteorological Organization at that time in Geneva, met and looked at the data that they were collecting, observing, and realized that the climate had started to change faster than normal. They observed and they made a calculation, and in fact, more than correlation, they were able to establish causation between the levels of carbon dioxide and other related greenhouse gases that were building up in the atmosphere and the rate of global warming. And they said, look, this is going to be really serious because 1.5 degrees or even 1 degree at that time warming would create some serious problems. And we can talk about those briefly, but let me just show you the trajectory. So at that time, we said, all right, as a world community, we need to take collective action because climate change cannot be solved by any one country or one government or a single actor, even the United Nations. We need collective action. And to do this, it might be best if we had a kind of a convention framework under which all actors can contribute to solving or attempting to solve, one might say, this problem. They were hopeful that we will solve it because we have had one brilliant example, maybe the only one I can think of, in which collective global action actually solved a global problem, which was the ozone hole, the ozone layer, which was solved by the Montreal Protocol, where the world came together and took action to reduce the chlorofluorocarbons and other ozone depleting substances. And that was significantly reduced, and the ozone hole was covered over. The ozone layer regenerated itself. That was a great example, the only one I think I can refer to as such. Coming back to climate change, we recognized that and started the process leading to the Climate Change Framework Convention and signed it as a global community in 1992. I was engaged in that process. At that time, I lived in the Caribbean. I was living in St. Lucia and contributed from the perspective of the small island states, which recognized themselves as frontline states in the sense that they were not contributing to the problem in any significant way, but they were going to suffer tremendously as the sea levels were going to rise. Being small islands, their coasts were critical to their survival. 1992, we signed a convention. Let's go forward so I don't bore our listeners and jump to 2015. After lots of struggles from 1992 to 2015, the world meets in Paris and says, guys, we are not doing well enough. Things are getting worse. Greenhouse gases are still increasing. So then they decided on a bunch of goals. They decided on these nationally determined greenhouse gas contributions that each country will seek to reduce its greenhouse gases and voluntarily set targets, which they did. And then the world, the small islands, among others, said, look, we are already near 1 degree. If we exceed 1.5, in fact, their slogan in Paris and later was 1.5 to stay alive. That was the slogan of the small island states, so that the world temperature should not increase above 1.5. And then 2023, we exceeded the 1.5 degree that we were hoping to keep. And greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase. So the world is saying, look, we have to increase and we will do worse until we can do better. So they have dates like carbon neutrality, where the amount emitted and the amount absorbed will balance each other. So net zero is what the term being used. Some countries and groups of countries were saying 2035. I think most of them now are around 2050, but they will at least start reducing from 2030. So most are still going up. So greenhouse gases continue to increase. Fossil fuel continue to be the dominant fuel. It's about 80% of all energy consumed. While we feel like we are making some progress with green and renewables, the percent in the energy mix is yet so very small and is kind of added on because the world total energy consumption continues to increase. So what are we seeing here? On the one hand, we know we have to reduce the greenhouse gases. On the other hand, economies are driven largely by fossil fuels. In today's world, politicians are the primary policymakers in democratic states, although citizens contribute. So they have to take care of economies, take care of this generation. The issue is what we call intergenerational equity. How do we meet today's needs while protecting options and opportunities for the future? So it's not like people wake up in the morning and say, we should just damage the planet. It's a real complex problem because you have to meet, like take India. The government of India will say we have 400 million very poor people. They will die unless they get, electricity, or they will suffer at least, get sick and so on until they get health care. And so we need to grow the economy and so on. Others make all kinds of arguments. So on the one hand, we have the challenges of today's well-being of human beings while attempting to protect the planetary ecosystem so we have a future together. And the two are conflicting. And so we are not solving it. It continues to get worse. And that's where we're at. That's a classic example of a wicked policy problem at work.
Wow. Okay, there's a lot in there that I can see many trails we can take on. To stick with the wicked policy problem and just to help us really get comfortable and understand that more, so you've outlined the number of solutions, SDGs, green revolution, renewables, the commitments for carbon emission, carbon zero. To what extent are these solutions themselves accurate responses to an understanding of the problem? Which is, do these solutions truly understand this wicked public policy problem that we're facing? Because as you articulated, if we don't understand the wickedness, then we are constantly creating new problems. I mean, I think the two examples I can think of techno-solutionism, we think AI will help us perhaps with climate, but on the other hand, the data centers and the energy cost of AI itself creates new problems and new challenges. And I think in renewables as well, there's a lot of data to show that the cost itself of manufacturing, whether it's windmills or solar panels, other lithium-ion batteries, it themselves have a huge cost on the planet. So just to bring back that question and to wrap our head around this wicked problem that we face, how much of these solutions that you outlined necessarily are built for purpose to deal with the wicked policy challenge? Because then there's the second layer of implementation, which you articulated, right? Which is like they may be the right ones, but we're not really implementing it. Are they even the right paths, and do we need to revisit them?
Right. So there are a number of layers to what we are discussing. So we might say the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is the overall solution, the drastic reduction of greenhouse gases. In fact, if we get and when we get to carbon neutrality, to net zero, that we have a solution because we would be in a sort of self-sustaining mood. And that might be an overall goal. The path to get there is proving really, really difficult from a policy perspective because we are finding all kinds of trade-offs. The first big trade-off is countries that can afford to cut back on greenhouse gases are doing all kinds of other things. Take, for example, the United States. United States just pulled out because they figured out that climate change is not even real. I mean, there is a notion in the United States among some policymakers, one might say, and therefore they pulled out of the climate change protocol. When they do that, European Union and other countries, Japan and so on, Canada, will say, well, look, this is a global problem. If you are not going to be involved, why should we try on our own and struggle with our economies? Or we have issues as well. So that's one problem where we look over our shoulder at what our neighbors are doing, which is important because it is a global problem. And if the biggest economy is not going to take action, we have a problem. So there's this political problem that we have, the global collective political consensus and action. That's one. And it's not only a challenge of political at the administrative level. I believe that the electorate that voted President Trump into power in the United States was quite aware of his position on climate change. He'd done it before. We had Trump 1.0. So there is this bunch of people who are prepared to say, that's all right, we can get ahead. It doesn't really matter. One person put it, I don't remember the name now, who said that why should I even bother about future generations? What have they ever done for me? So that kind of naivete, that kind of short-sightedness is present in humans, where they truly cannot go beyond immediate material needs. That leads me to the second or the deepest layer. So that is one of the top layers. The deepest layers is the human, and we'll come back and talk about that. Human understanding of their own true nature. That's another deep layer. And in between these two layers, we have issues of technology, we have issues of equity or the sharing of the technology, we have issues of inequality, economic inequality, we have social exclusion issues. So when we take action on climate change, is that action just in the sense, of the multiple differential impacts that climate change will have on different socioeconomic and ethnic groups? The impact is not the same. So that those are some of the variables that are interacting and that we need to be collectively taking action on. So we can do a root cause analysis and say, all right, greenhouse gas emissions are the immediate apparent cause. But I might argue that the greenhouse gas emissions is a symptom of overconsumption, of human overconsumption of energy and matter. And if that's the second layer, so we have greenhouse gas emissions, so we have climate change, greenhouse gas emissions driving that, overconsumption driving greenhouse gases, and one might say poor consumption habits in terms of what we use to drive our sort of voracious need for energy. And below that, consumption problem is the issue where we tie quality of life with consumption. So we believe that the more we consume, the better quality of life we have. We have failed as a global human community to divorce consumption from quality of life. Despite the evidence, it is clear that yes, we need a certain level of material growth and comfort, but over a certain threshold level, increased consumption does not lead to any of the better improvement of the indicators of well-being. But that's the point at which we confuse need and want. So all our wants become needs and we justify them in various ways. And then why then are we in this problem where we can't separate or decouple consumption from quality of life and get down to well-being? And at that level, we begin to try and understand what well-being is. When you look at the well-being indicators of any country or any part of the world or the multilateral system, they largely speak to health, education, a bunch of social issues, and some physiological issues and psychological. They do tackle one or two psychological issues, mental health and so on are there. as part of the well-being framework. The WHO definition of health mentions the word spiritual, but when you look at the indicators, it's not there. So we have not, I believe, as a global policy community, spent enough time to understand that inner challenge I talked about, the psyche, the relationship of the psyche, to us understanding who we are and how we make decisions for what purpose. So that's where I think we are. That's what we call causes, like greenhouse gas emissions, at some level, when you do a root cause analysis,
Symptoms.
because symptoms.
Yeah. That's a really valuable root cause analysis that you just did with us. And I think so what I'm hearing very clearly is that this perhaps still stuck on the level of symptoms, and even the responses to climate change, which are seen in some rooms as responding to the cause, are not actually getting deep enough, which perhaps then speaks to the second layer, or the higher layers, which we just talked about, which is the lack of will, which is even if we know what the problem is, which we think we do, which we think is, greenhouse emissions, we still don't have the will because our leaders, our systems are geared for something else, are geared for, economic growth, is which requires fossil fuel emissions and requires that kind of extraction on the earth. So I want to go a bit more into climate, and definitely we will go into this question of the human layer and this getting to that root, because I think a big part of my Light Forest podcast is getting to the root of where we are. But I want to double click a little bit on some of the higher layers first. Particularly, you mentioned the lack of will just now. You mentioned early on in your remarks about the SDGs were created, but you even have doubts whether they were actually created to actually be implemented. And the lack of will among countries, the lack of will within the international system. I mean, you also work closely on poverty, and I think we've seen there's a lot of data to show again on how, despite the billions of dollars spent on poverty eradication or this kinds of inequality, the situation seems to be getting worse. So the question that comes to me is that, do we have the institutions that are fit to deal with this wicked policy problem? Like, how much of faith, because all of us listening in, most of us are in some way relying on our politicians, on some leading companies, if you will, to get ourselves out. At least the thinking is that I can't do it on my own. I'm going to rely on governments and policy for large scale changes. You work so closely, you walk the halls with, many of these leaders. How much trust or faith can we really have? And do we really need to go elsewhere? Can we hold this present system to change? And how much trust can we place in this to actually approach this wicked policy problem?
See, I mentioned the issue of will, but we have to be careful to do two things. One is to understand political will, and political will in any democratic country is not merely a function of the leaders, it's a function of what the leaders sense that the electorate is ready to accept so that, they can be elected or re-elected. So the will must reside at the level of the electorate as well as at the level of the leaders. Because yes, leaders need to take bold positions and bring their people along. That's perhaps a basic definition of leadership. And so there is this tug of war in where the electorate is not yet ready to demand and take action at the ballot box so that political leaders are nudged or pushed in the right direction. That, of course, requires awareness building, which we have been talking about for 5 or 6 decades. So we continue to beat on that drum of awareness building. See, the awareness building we have been doing is like information sharing, and that's one level of awareness building. That's good. And in some cases, we have school curricula incorporating information on climate change and poverty and so on. That's also helpful. But I will argue that the fundamental awareness, being aware that you are aware, and that part has not been tackled. That part we will come back to and talk a bit. That is where all of this seems to be pointing to.
Yeah.
And but no, go ahead.
So here's a tension point that I think is quite interesting, because you outlined that very nice root cause analysis, right, where you talked about the connection of our belief that consumption equals to a quality of life, and this very important belief and narrative. Now, I could say also that my beliefs and our beliefs and narratives that we hold are also conditioned by the cultures that we grew up in. And
Absolutely.
so, naturally there's that relationship there. Here's the question that I struggle with, which is if the economies and if the political systems are reliant on me continuing holding on to this belief that consumption means I will live a happier life and that a nation is needed in order for me to feel safe, and therefore we must live in this imaginary of the nation state, then in some ways, even though, as you say, the electorate have the, politicians are sensing the electorate and that, that change can happen that way, I feel, and maybe the counter to that in some ways, that we're still downstream of the, the media narratives and control from the cultures that we grow onto. So how do we deal with this difficult entanglement where if I actually change my beliefs, then the systems that are actually geared for consumption start to struggle or fail, and then that's the knot that I struggle with, is like how do we deal with this seemingly unaligned incentive?
So before I answer that, let me, you did raise a question about poverty and the lack of progress.
Yeah.
I think in order to be balanced and recognize the data as it is, we need to say that we have made progress on poverty.
Mm.
Globally, we have made significant progress, one might say, on poverty reduction. In the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded the Sustainable Development Goals, the target was to reduce extreme poverty by 50% by 2015 compared to 1990 levels. And the world achieved that on average prior to 2015. Of course, it was not uniform. Some countries did so well that it pulled up the global average. And that major country was China, that lifted 470 million people out of poverty. So the world average was there. Poverty got worse in some other areas. But we need to recognize that. India has just been seeing significant poverty reduction, massive. And that's one of the countries with the most poor people in the world. So there is progress on that front. And there is progress on a number of fronts, significant progress of the SDGs. So when we said that, it was not, you used the word implemented, but I had used the word achieved.
Mm.
So yes, action has been taken to implement, but whether we would fully achieve them, that I had doubt that we all agreed on at the beginning. Now, coming back to the question that you have just posed, the issues that I think about how do we align our thinking, and how does it link up? You had also raised a question earlier, and I would link the two together, the institutions,
Mm.
and whether the institutions are fit for purpose. I believe that humans need the kind of awareness we are talking about. We need, as individuals, to look at the world, to look at ourselves, and come to our conclusions. But in order to do that, we have to recognize, as you mentioned, the conditioning that each one of us has. And that conditioning is leading us to make decisions which are based on what has come before us.
Mm.
We are therefore in a seriously fragmented situation in which it is going to be almost impossible to make progress in the way we need to unless we take some other forms of action.
Mm.
Those other forms of action are coming to the understanding of who we truly are, understanding what one might call the inner dimension
Mm.
of the humans, which is not really inner, which we will
Mm.
talk about. But on the institutions, we have a world that has been designed based upon the thinking of Newton, Descartes, and Bacon of 400 years ago. That thinking is linear, deterministic, reductionist in nature. The economic way of thinking, neoclassical economics, has made assumptions such as all humans do is try to maximize their own self interest, that we have perfect information sets, that we are perfectly rational, and that the
Mm.
rational mind is the most important instrument that we have, and that the spiritual side or the intuitive side is much less or even non-existent. All of these factors have led to institutions that are not fit for purpose for the
Mm.
ultimate solutions. That would be my argument
Mm.
for those reasons. So we have a mismatch in public policy, in institutions, and in lifestyles and awareness, all of these working with each other, it is as though we will continue to walk to the brink of extinction. Now, what I don't think it'll be a linear pathway. So we will probably walk to the brink of extinction, but we might behave quite differently in the face of extreme crisis. Maybe, maybe not.
Mm,
So, the scenario should not be seen as totally doomsday. I think that will be wrong because change patterns are not necessarily linear. So while it is looking really bad at the moment, we might make a sudden shift.
yeah.
And social change and economic change has been shown to have some lurches along the way. And maybe humanity will come to a collective self-realization suddenly without
Yeah.
us being able to predict it
Yeah.
and change course.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll happen.
Wow, that's really deep. I just want to, hold this point that you just drew out for us, right? That these institutions are not fit for purpose and are really an outcome of specific points of view, or assumptions of human nature, assumptions of reality that root perhaps in the last 400-500 years, going back to the Enlightenment period and perhaps even before that. That's really, it's really a big, and I feel like sometimes just doesn't make it into the mainstream understanding at all. And the work that you're doing really, I find really eye-opening, because it's really helping us to then navigate this deep this deep seeing that we have to do. Because what I hear you say, and you've brought this up multiple times as well, which is this understanding of who we are. And if we can't rely on the institutions, because as you just masterfully articulated, they're not fit for purpose, then we in some way have to start to cultivate a certain evolution in our own understandings. The word you used was awareness. So, we need to start to cultivate awareness for ourselves and start to really understand the roots to the world and start to make change. And certainly that resonates with me and my own journey. And in the beginning of the bio, I also mentioned, you doing work on applied spirituality, and you talked about this. Then, as you find the root, it seems to me that the root is very clear, lying in our faulty understanding of who we are and this spiritual crisis. Help us walk through this space where sometimes words are difficult to really explain, but we try and we use words, and you have words like applied spirituality and conscious policy and other phrases.
Okay.
Help us navigate on how the root really is spiritual, and how we can start to understand this wicked policy problem from this lens.
Right. So let me just make a distinction for purposes of clarity so our listeners really get the gist of what I'm saying. When I say institutions, I just want to make a distinction between institutions and organizations, because these two are sometimes conflated. By institutions, I use it in the way of meaning the rules of the game. How do we set up the rules, the social, economic, transaction rules, the way we play political games, and so on? Those rules are the institutions that I talk about, how they are designed, who designs them, and so on. Organizations, on the other hand, are actors. So they are like corporations or NGOs and so on. So I sometimes use football. I used to be a fan of Diego Maradona, that of
Likewise.
course back a long time. And he played for a club called Boca. So I would say the institution of football or soccer, some people say, the rules of the game of how football is played is the institution of football or soccer. The club is the organization where people get together and they play as a team, right? So just for us to get to understand what we are
I think
really
that's
talking about.
important, because I think sometimes I certainly will think of the institution in this case as almost the systems of rules, and then the nation states or the corporations or the NGOs as being the institutions. But I think this framing is really important.
Good. So once we have clarified that, so the institutions include, the public policies, the laws of the world, how they are structured, what defines our relationships between and states, international relations, or between states and people, the social contract. All of these our institutions and how they have been structured and how they need to change is what we are really talking about. Organizational capacity to get there is required as well, but that follows. So once we understand the challenge that
Because the
way, I
organizations are
think
like the football clubs, they've got to play by the rules.
aha, there you go. And when they don't play by the rules, that's why you have umpires and, referees and so on, so that we might play by the rules. But then somebody might bribe the referee and the umpire. And then we have what we call corruption, which
Yeah.
has become a new institution in its own right in so many countries.
Yeah.
Huge problem, right? So across Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and Europe, not exempt. So all these human societies are, yes, a set of rules which we agree we will play by, and we undermine them. That's a really difficult one as well, that in many ways we don't talk enough about, but are one of the layers that makes problems wicked. It's a real big problem. You try to solve a particular problem, but the institutions are rotting because of corruption. And if you look at that corruption, I will use that to come to the question you posed about this inner dimension that we are talking about. It leads back to that inner dimension and the values and the way we treat each other and the way we understand ourselves. So we use different words, as you correctly pointed out, like applied spirituality. We use words like, I got that phrase and started using it in the work that we do and my team from a reformer and a monk in India. His name was Swami Agnivesh, and he was also the head of a movement called Arya Samaj, which is a sort of a sect of Hinduism. And he was the head when I met him of Arya Samaj. And I found his book. He has a small book, wonderful read. I really encourage people to read it. The book is called Applied Spirituality. And that's where I got that title and I liked it. And why did I like it? Swami Agnivesh became a monk and was in, orange robes and so on, saffron robes and so forth, the latter part of his life. But when you look at his life, he was trained as a lawyer, taught law at university, ran for political office, became, I think, a law minister or something in his state. He did all of those things, realized that social change was not happening through these institutions that, so to speak, that he was working for, the rule of law and action, teaching and all of this. And then later in life, he became a social reformer and a monk, spent his life on social reform, was beaten up many times because of the position he took, very bold. And then he wrote this book, which is really eloquent in describing the importance of spiritual strength, understanding one's own self, and taking action from that level compared to either as a minister, a law minister, or a professor of law. And that little book, Applied Spirituality by Swami Agnivesh, is the one that gave me this phrase, applied spirituality. So it was not sort of my original phrase. And that phrase has, like you say, we all use words. So, and we're stuck with that. That's the only way to communicate, right? Of course, we can do art and music and so on as well. And those can help, perhaps, to explain better. But then the audience might not be, we might not attract a wide enough audience who might understand those symbolic forms of communication. But the other word is consciousness or consciousness-based thinking, alliances, action. And we might say conscious public policy, and I will be comfortable with that phrase. Or we might say awareness-based. Each of them has pros and cons. So some people, including some of my students, don't like the word spirituality because they think of religion immediately and they think of church and temple and mosque and they don't want to be involved in those things. And that's a big negative of using the word spirituality. On the other hand, the spiritual traditions have so much wisdom at their core that we don't want to lose that. I'm not talking about the dogma and the doctrine. So you look at Christianity, I'm not talking about either the New or the Old Testament. I'm talking about this mystical core of Christianity as explained and taught by people like Father Thomas Keating, Thomas Morton, Meister Eckhart, Teresa d'Avila, John of the Cross, the Desert Fathers, and so on. They have all grappled with the mystical core that Christ really lived for and attempted to teach through parables. But if you want to go directly to the core, one has to go to a different source, which I would suspect most Christians don't read or don't engage with. They are more engaged with the gospel. Or take Islam. The mystical core of Islam is taught by Sufism. But the Hadith and the Quran is what people are more engaged with rather than the mystical core of Sufism, where we find real joy.
Yeah, love,
Or
beauty.
take Hinduism.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really, really joyful and love. I mean, love is the organizing principle of Sufism. I take Hinduism. You look at India, and I ask the question whether India is too religious to be spiritual. So much of mythology and ritual, and the core of, let us say, Advaita Vedanta, the Upanishads, are kind of lost.
Yeah.
Few people may be engaged. If you talk to them about it, they say, they're very proud of it, but being proud of it is equally harmful because then the ego kicks in and not you. The true you gets covered over anyway, or Buddhism is probably closest. It doesn't have all this covering. It goes straight. Although now there is so much religion around the core teachings of the Buddha that Buddhism has become like a religion, or Taoism or Confucianism. So you can tend to lose that if we don't use the word spiritual, you see. So
Yeah.
it has a lot of value that way. And that's why we capture the phrase applied spirituality. But we are really talking about a consciousness based and awareness based. And sometimes I say in my work, I use the phrase wise policy making as distinct from evidence based policy, which is the common phrase in parlance in the policy world. And we can talk a bit about that. How do we link, or what do we mean by evidence based policy vis a vis wise policy or enlightened policy? So, so there are all these words. So the words thing is a challenge. There are pros and cons for whatever you use. Somebody's not going to like it. But the idea behind it and the work we are trying to do is to see whether we can begin to see the world as it is beyond our conditioning and then take action which we might call authentic action. So the word holistic is thrown around a lot, and the word authentic is thrown around a lot. But if you ask people, what do you understand and how would you do holistic? It typically will be integrative work. That is to say, they will take the small pieces which they accept as reality and then seek to bring them together and call it holism. I call that an integrative approach. You're accepting the world as fragmented and then bringing it together. But holism for me is not integration as such. Seeing the world as it truly is a whole phenomenon. It is us who fragment it because of our training, our conditioning. Our minds are fundamentally fragmented. So we have to go beyond the conditioning and see, the natural mind without all the history that it has with it, our ancestors and our parents and our teachers, all reinforcing that fragmentation. Now, academically, one might say that the fragmentation really took root with the scientific enterprise when science became dominant. And science, as we said before, became dominant, at the time of Newton, Descartes, and Bacon. And since then, we have had this fragmentation in all of our sciences. So scientific knowledge is largely arising from what we call our rational or left brain. So we have, like Einstein, well, it's attributed to Einstein, but it's really Bob Samples that said, very, very brilliantly, we have, as humans, we have a sacred gift, the intuitive mind. And we have a faithful servant, the rational mind. All of us humans have both, and they are important. Problem is that we have created a society that worships the servant and has forgotten the gift. That's the problem that we have created. See, so our work on applied spirituality is how do we approach public policy? How do we approach the wicked problems of the world, which at the root, fundamental root level, is one of inner fragmentation? You started out this podcast by saying, by using a lovely quote from Krishnamurti, in which he and you quoted him, that the world that we see is the reflection of what our minds are. And, he has also been credited with um, to be well adjusted to a sick society is no measure of health. That one is even more profound. So then we have to take action now to how do we get the wholeness within? And that's the heart of our work. And from that wholeness, how then do we make public policy that is not fragmented, but that is whole and reflects this kind of value? And we believe out of this kind of, well, I don't like the word healing, but that word is around a lot, or authenticity, that we might begin to have a real kind of revolution in the way we as humans relate to the world. So the way we relate to the world and to all other living beings and to the planet as a whole, including all the life support systems, whether they be rivers or rocks or plants or biodiversity, whatever they are. The ultimate solution lies there in my view, but the apparent solutions with which the world is busy, with which it thinks it can take action, is what preoccupies 99% of our energy. Total mismatch. So that's where we're at. That's the inner dimension that we are talking about. And I've been working on. I came to this after, like you mentioned in my bio intro, about 30 years of working in on sustainable development mainly, on engaged with the MDGs and the SDGs, working from the multilateral level in the United Nations, mainly UNDP, but many other UN bodies, both as a staff member and later as a consultant, working with the federal government of Canada in the policy branch of the Canadian International Development Agency, working at the ground level in more than 50 countries around the world, so engaging directly with policymakers, communities, people. I've been, during that time, a visiting professor at many universities, so engaging with academic thinking and seeing how their minds are and how they do their work, which is also important. And even served in a policy think tank kind of NGO, if you like, in Canada, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And prior to that, as I mentioned, in the Caribbean, worked at the regional level with governments at the regional. So I've seen policy from all these levels and engaged closely with policymakers, former ministers and presidents and current ministers and so on. After all of that, I reflected on what was missing. Why is it that we still were struggling? So I thought complexity theory would give me the answers. So I've been working with complexity, complex adaptive systems thinking. That's a great way of understanding how things are together and trying to see the wholeness in the world. And I thought I'd figured it out. But many others have been using systems for 70 years. General systems theory came into being, I think, around 1962. And then it dawned on me that I was missing half, at least half of the equation, which was the inner dimension.
Wow. Maybe this is a really, you just referenced your 30-year journey, which is, I mean, I feel really grateful that we can have this conversation and that you're sharing this wisdom and knowledge that you've gleaned, with me and hopefully several listeners listening and also feeling as I am feeling right now. I think it's just so great to hear you articulate these problems and share your experience, which is from deep in the, let's just say, belly of the beast, if you will, which you've seen through your own direct experience. The question that comes to me also then is, take me back a little bit to your own journey to starting to change the way you saw the world, how you started to see life, how you started to understand who you are. Maybe walk me through maybe some chapters, some moments, how they maybe interacted with your own work, that helped you start to see this route for yourself and
Right.
translate this into a policy framing.
Right. So it's been a long journey in some ways and maybe very short in other ways. But we'll make it short so we don't bore our, let's see if we can put it in a cogent way. So as I recall growing up in Guyana as a little boy, I had a great childhood. I was fortunate that way. I hear stories of, people who have made it in the world who struggled a lot. I had a happy childhood, as I recall. I sometimes tell people that I did not know I was poor until I studied poverty.
It's
So
great,
until I
great
learned the
line.
definition, yeah, until I learned the definitions of the World Bank and the UN and so on. So happy childhood, and I grew up um, in a Hindu family. I was born in a Arya Samaj family in Guyana. My great grandfather, well, I should start at the beginning and say that my great grandfather, I'm fourth generation Indian. He migrated from India, settled in the Caribbean. He came as an indentured laborer. I think my great grandmother as well. I know more about my great grandfather because my father knew more about him and told us more. So growing up, I was exposed to the thinking, the philosophy, of Arya Samaj, and I got attracted to that as a young boy, but not to so much the ritual side, which I did not mind, but it was not like exciting to me. But I then became involved in yoga and started practicing yoga around maybe 12 or something on my own. And I could, but I was more interested in the physical sort of benefits of yoga. I could rest, and I still have that ability. I
Mm.
could rest for a half hour, for example, and become rested during the day, fully rested. And so I can work long days, things like that. Though that was with me. And then I got really caught up with education and living in a Western type society. I found a dichotomy between what I was feeling internally, the spiritual side, the yoga side, and so on, with the world that I lived in, where people didn't talk about those things. So you go to school and then you get educated, you get a job. So I finished my bachelor's degree, just jumping forward in natural sciences, and the Shell Oil Company came to campus to hire, and they interviewed a bunch of us, and I was selected for this chemical sales representative job. And they hired me and trained me to promote chemicals. Some are agricultural, some are industrial. And among the agricultural chemicals was a chemical that could kill all the weeds in canals. And that was important in Guyana because big barges came through these canals to transport sugarcane to the sugar factories. So they had to keep these canals free of weeds. And Shell had developed this chemical that could control these weeds. And I was promoting this to the sugar estates. That was my job. So one day someone asked me, do you ever even know what is the effect of this chemical on the fish and the shrimp that live in these canals? And I said, no, I don't know. Well, why should I care? And having said that, I left that conversation, but then it sort of stung my mind. It came back and said, you used to eat fish when you were growing up in the countryside and shrimp, and people made a living. How come you don't care? So
Mm.
this started to bother me. How come I had arrived at that point in my life where I was making good money, working for this big corporate capitalist company, but perhaps doing harm? So that awakening is the big one that I recall because after that, I thought I need to know what's going on with the fish life. And so I went on to do a master's degree in pesticide residue analysis. And I wanted to do that in a tropical agricultural environment because that's where I lived and that's what I knew. And the best school at that time doing this kind of work was one in India, the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in New Delhi. Fortunately, I was able to get a Commonwealth scholarship that paid for me to study there, did my master's, went back to the Caribbean, to Guyana. And then a little while later, after I was working, the University of the West Indies wanted to set up a facility to do this kind of environmental work. I was the only one in the Caribbean region at that time with this training, so they persuaded me. They said, look, we'll waive your fees. We'll give you a little scholarship money. In return, you set up a pesticide residue laboratory for us, and you do your PhD at the same time. So that's the way I ended up doing my PhD. Having done that, I then set up the Caribbean Environmental Health Institute for CARICOM. And after 7 years, I asked these guys, the ministers of health and environment, to give me a year to do a sabbatical. And I said, no, 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 we can't do that. You must stay. This institute needs you. We are doing really well. And I said, what about 6 months? They did not agree to that either. And so I said, what about if I quit? And they said, no, no, you wouldn't do that. But that's what I did because I wanted to do more advanced policy thinking and research. And so I had a taste of the policy work because 1989, and this is another seminal milestone or a shift,
Mm.
realizing that scientists like myself at that time We were studying the symptoms of the environmental problem. We were measuring pollution levels and so on, and the richness or not of sediment communities, biodiversities. But the cause of the problem was political and economic decision making. I realized at that time, 3 years after my PhD in the natural sciences. And so I wrote a paper, I did a lot of work and went to a big conference on economics. Paper was accepted. World Bank economists and a bunch of top level guys, Robert Repetto from the World Resources Institute, I recall, was there and so on. And I presented a paper essentially arguing that it is faulty economic decision making that was at the cause or the heart of the environmental issues. And that if economists were asked to correct the policy problems of the world, they will only do more harm. Essentially, is what I argued. I thought they would kick me out of the conference because these are all, high flying economists. The program chair, who was a professor of economics at the University of the West Indies, came to me afterwards and said, I'm fascinated by what you said, and I'd like to invite you to come and develop a new course and teach it in the Consortium Graduate School of Social Sciences. If you would, great opportunity, big risk. I took it and developed a new course called Sustainable Development Economics. I hadn't studied economics at any time in my life, but I really learned as much as I could, designed the course, taught it with him, being in the classroom, guiding and learning. And that was my shift to the social sciences. So when the ministers would not give me a sabbatical, I quit and went off to IISD, where I did advanced policy research. And my research question was how to conserve the environment and get people out of poverty at the same time. And that led to my work on sustainable livelihoods. That's the phrase we used. There was one paper in the literature in 1992 written by Chambers and Conway on sustainable livelihoods. We did this research built on that paper from 1993 to 1996. That's when the UN liked what I had done and invited me to introduce these ideas. That's how I ended up at the UN. This work, however, spawned a lot of global thinking research on sustainable livelihoods. Now there must be 500,000 papers in the literature on sustainable livelihoods. So that's been the trajectory of the interaction of science and policy throughout my life in a way. But the core spiritual side was always there, but taking a backseat because it did not fit. If you said to anybody that in the world, of the UN, of the federal government of Canada, of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, that you figured that there must be some inner dimension at work, you probably lose your job. You'll be totally marginalized as a wild new age or something. So I had to wait until the time I felt was right and I could take the courage, I got the courage that I didn't care whether the world would shut me down or not. The time was right to go and really say what you truly believed was the core problem, which I started to do 7, 8 years ago, but I had to do it in a safe space. And academia gave me that chance. Story of my entire life.
Wow. Wow, that's so interesting that you knew and you had to almost separate, these two worlds, lives. Was that jarring? Did that poke at you? What was that? I mean, of course I totally understand that the worlds that you just described 30, 40 years ago, wouldn't had different rules, different norms and different opportunities that maybe are there now. But yeah, what was that like living this kind of duality?
It was schizophrenic and it was a bit painful and sometimes because I wanted to know why do I have to live these two separate lives? One in which was had to be a personal, almost private kind of life that sometimes I felt like it was not even legit because I might be, sort of having this ancient or reptilian emotions in a world that had advanced, and this sort of vestige of backwardness was still embedded in me. One would question whether that was in fact the case until I started to go deeper and deeper into my meditation and my reading on philosophical literature. I became more and more confident that I was understanding, and there was enough literature, serious literature, although not academic literature, because a lot of this work is done by yogis and saints and sages and spiritual leaders scared to publish academically, right?
Yeah.
But I took that challenge. I said, maybe the time has come when there is enough rigor and deep enough understanding for us to give it the veneer of academia. And finally, I was able to make this convergence and in a way become whole. In a way,
Mm.
this schizophrenia disappeared. So I
Wow.
am so much more comfortable in my skin at this point, if you like.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that experience of going through this transition. So in some ways you had always then had this intuitive mind, this awareness of this intuitive mind, awareness itself, which you had been, holding on almost maybe kind of firewalled in a sense with the rational mind, as you say, was the only one that was accepted. And in this world where, to quote what you said about institutions, in an institution where the rules of the game are, we worship the rational mind, and in a culture where we've made the servant the master, then you kind of have to play in that game. So then perhaps mirroring your this transition journey you said of how you took that upon your challenge, to bring the mystic, if you will, to bring the intuitive, bring the wisdom into this with a veneer of academia. Maybe jogging a little back to early in our conversation where we left it, which was also about the fact that we have these problematic ontologies. We have this culture where we're now living in with these false belief systems about what makes us happy, about consumption being so tied to my well-being and happiness, and this culture where the rational mind is so elevated, that we're just closed off to other spaces of intuition and wisdom. How are you then now channeling this into words and into policy? You mentioned wise policy or enlightened policy, and perhaps this is what you referred to in as a way to bridge or bring. I mean, since we're on the light forest walk right now, I'll say to bring more light into how we regenerate. Which, yeah. So what's been your, yeah? Describe a little bit that pathway then.
Right. So there are a few directions that we are pursuing. How do we bring these things together? So there are conceptual and there are what we do institutionally and so on. I'll give you a little insight into both. So at the conceptual and framework and academic level, the first big question, as I mentioned, that we had, or in a way an entry point, is that policymakers and policy analysts pride themselves on something we call evidence-based policy. Now, a lot of policy in democratic societies is not fully evidence-based. It hopefully will capture some amount of evidence because at the end of the day, policy is a process of contestation. There's a lot of vested interest, and governments have to deal with. There might be corporate interest, civil society interest, party member interest, and so on. And policy leaders have to balance these interests. Now, they bring evidence into that process as best as they can. Some people do. Some people have not evidence-based policy, but policy-based evidence. So policy-based evidence, the classic example was George Bush and Iraq, the global example in which the evidence was cooked up to match the policy objective of invading Iraq, which was already decided. And then you get decent people like Colin Powell being sent to the UN to make this poor fellow this presentation based on cooked up evidence. But I took that evidence-based policy and I said, all right, that's a accepted and treasured way of policy making. But unpack the evidence. What is in the evidence that we are talking about? And we are saying that the evidence for public policy has data, information, knowledge, and should have wisdom. These four elements: data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And that one leads to the other one. We have a lot of data, so much that we call it big data, right? Lots of data. And as we go down the spectrum, we have less conversion of data into information, which has more context and analysis, and then knowledge, which has more application, and then wisdom, which has more judgment, good sense. And we find about zero wisdom. So it starts with lots of data and it diminishes as you go down. We are saying then, how do we correct this and increase the wisdom content of the evidence package that goes into the policy process. And to bring this wisdom in, we need to address policy design, policy analysis, policy formulation, and how we monitor and evaluate policy. All must shift and get more indicators of the wisdom side, not only the data. So that work we are doing and articulating how that is to be done. We are publishing and so on, but we are struggling to publish work in this area because the journals, the editors of these journals come from the traditional public policy world. We are getting some work published, but it's a bit of an uphill battle, one might say. But it's happening. It's starting to happen. So that's one way how we are doing it. Now, that's just the conceptual way. Wise policy making is increasing the content, the wisdom content of the evidence-based policy. Enlightened policy is bringing in more of the applied spirituality, more of the consciousness-based or pure awareness-based, the wholeness dimension into the public policy. And that also is a part of the wisdom. So these two overlap. But for different audiences, we might use the phrase enlightened public policy, moving from fragmentation to wholeness. And we are doing that now and testing it in education mainly. So we're looking at curricula in K to 12. So we have my colleague working in the network, the Spirituality, Science and Policy Network, who you, I think, met now. Devesh Gupta is currently conducting, and part of his life's work is working with schools and bringing this thinking into the education. And we hope that we will influence education policy in India. So the new education policy has enough space for us to do this work, but it's not being done. So that we are doing. And institutionally, the way we are bringing this all together is we have the, as you know, the science, the Spirituality, Science and Policy Network, SSP, on the Emerge website. We started with our Center for Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy, where 3 or 4 of colleague academics are working, and we have a bunch of students interested in this. Many of them are research assistants, so they are learning and writing as well with us on these subjects. We are publishing. So we had one book come out in 24 on applied spirituality and sustainable development policy, academic publication. I'm the lead editor of that book. Another one that's just has come out for pre-ordering and will be launched on the 15th of, released on the 15th of August, which is the handbook on global philosophies for AI ethics, published by Routledge. The previous one is published by Emerald, and we are looking at 1 or 2 others now. But people are becoming engaged and attracted to this thinking. One colleague you connected us to, Anthony Maces, through your connections in Taiwan, I believe, and he contacted me and we hit it off. We had lunch and had a great conversation, and he is really taken with what we are doing. And so Anthony has proposed that he and I do a book addressing wicked policy problems and bringing in the inner dimension. So I'm reflecting on that now. I had a young professor, assistant professor, who has 2 master's degrees and a PhD in Malaysia, just contacting me and saying, I'm a PhD in economics. I am getting flustered with this economics really can't deliver on the world's challenges. I really like what you guys are doing. How can I become involved? So most likely he can become a fellow and member of the network. So institutionally, what we are doing. Conceptually, I have explained it. And then the networking and partnerships with people like the Light Forest and Cosmo Local, your own group. So it was really a delight for me to having met you and engaged that evening with a group of people. It was a wonderful evening. And some of these issues were articulated at that point, but not as fully as we have had the chance to do. So, it comes like in a little nice circle, and the way the world really is, all circular, right? Not linear. Although circles are linear.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I'll express my gratitude that, you've made that, open the pathway and, creating this new space for translation. And at the start of the conversation, I called you a bridge builder, but really I think pioneer and bridge builder, deserve to go hand in hand. We're sort of reaching towards the end of the podcast, although I have many questions still to go. And if I there's maybe a few that's still coming to mind. One is, you just talked about a lot of the publishing and the kind of writing work that's happening. How do you work with the scholars who are clearly skilled with the rational mind, because they wouldn't be scholars otherwise? How do you help them open to the intuitive mind? What Tyson Yonkaputra will call the ancestor mind, that allows us to go beyond the conditioning, the limits of what we think is possible. And as you talked about also early on in this conversation, that while we feel that things are so bad, and it feels like solutions are so far away, shifts can happen in complex systems sometimes overnight. Big changes can happen in ways that we don't fully understand or predict. So these kinds of pathways are still possible. But in some ways, it will involve us opening ourselves to more wisdom. How do you create that structure or that way for these scholars to do that?
Right. And we'll make it short as time is starting to run out on us. I like your phrase, the ancestor mind. I think it couples well with the reptilian brain. So these two probably go together. But we have, fortunately, you have to look for them, but we have people who are also making this transition. They are scattered and not easily found, but you have to search and we find them. And one leads to another. Like how you have connected me to Anthony, for example, and he is keen and we might do something, which he has not yet done, right? He has worked with systems and complexity theory, but not the inner dimension, which will now happen. That's a good example. Like the guy in Malaysia I just mentioned. He has trained in traditional economics, is getting flustered and frustrated because it's not fixing issues he would like to see fixed. He's coming on board. And these volumes we write, for example, have 13, 14 chapters, each by a different scholar. You have to search for them and then get them on board. And then once you have found them, they are there. There might be 100 in the world, and so not easy in a population of 8 billion. So you have to really search, but we find them. You found, for example, my friend and colleague Thomas Legrand in Paris. He lives near Thich Nhat Hanh, the
Okay. Plum
famous
Village.
Buddhist monk in
Yeah.
Plum Village, and he had written this book called The Politics of Being. That really grabbed my attention. He wasn't then a professor in a university, but he's just finished a PhD and written this book, which has gotten attention, and we joined forces. So then he would also connect me, and one will lead to the other, and the snowballing goes on like that. That's how it's been growing,
Mm.
and we're finding a few in India as well. So that's the way we have been getting others to come on board. And as we publish, people read, and they come and they check us out and say, "Could I join the band?" Let's see what happens. So people are coming on board that way. I do not try to get to persuade people who are of a fundamentally different mindset. I don't think that anybody who joins us will win the Nobel Prize in a hurry, because the Nobel Committee is likely to give prizes to people who do more and more of, using the rational scientific framework.
Yeah. I think of the Krishnamurti quote
But,
you said
but I
earlier as
hope
well.
that they will change.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I hope that we can have an impact on the Nobel Committee and that they will change their approach.
So what I hear from you is actually the word that comes to me is community. This, each of us
Yeah.
finding each other, each of us having our own community, and then these communities connecting to each other, and through that creating the conditions for emergence. To use another complexity word of, new systems coming from emergence, and really it's us starting to shift in our own lives, starting to find others who might be making similar shifts and start to, create this snowball effect that you just described.
Perfectly put. Perfectly put, Dave. That's exactly. There cannot be a deliberate scaling of this, like one might, traditionally think that you have now some ideas, let's scale it up. That would not work. That's no way is that going to work. It will emerge.
Yeah. Yeah. And I certainly feel like, in my own journey, as I, start to find people like yourselves, in just a year ago, I would have found I would have been very, very surprised to know that there are, the kind of work and people that are doing this. And, in just a year, been able to open myself to a lot. Can I ask a quick question, maybe on behalf of the many listeners, perhaps not listeners yet, but friends, colleagues who are in academia, who are in policy, who are and I can attest this for sure, frustrated with the state of the world, who are, wondering what is to be done. Do you have any, yeah, how do you speak to these kinds of people who you would say, let's say on the fringe, who would still find spirituality to be too woo-woo or too, in some cases too religious? How do you speak and engage to these people? Because I think that's also important to know.
We are very open in this regard. We are delighted to engage with anyone who is interested, and we are ready to meet people where they are in terms of where they are as an individual in their own intellectual or spiritual development, on, and two, where they are in terms of their life, career, institution, and so on. And then we would identify what makes sense for them, what is possible and feasible, and how we can then partner to walk the road, to walk in the forest together. So that's been our approach. And so if a assistant professor from Malaysia speaks to us, it's a different path, and we will join hands and walk that path. Or if an advanced publisher and scholar like Anthony here wants to join hands, we will do that. And if it is an undergraduate student or a master's student or a PhD student, again, if it's a teacher or a community activist, we'll do exactly the same. And it's in that way, hopefully the community grows, but the communion is also important. And that's the open-mindedness that we use. And we sort of not say, this is what you have to do. This here is a formula. Not that at all. We meet people where they are, open up our minds, and then let what happens emerge.
Wow, that's beautiful. We started off with this conversation on wicked problems, but I feel like the tone of our conversation, the frequency has shifted in the sense that, we see that there might be completely radical ways where we can start to shift, and that there are people like yourselves and others who are starting to make changes with the institutions, with the organizations, and I'm certainly hopeful, and I use the word hopeful more in a sense of the state of being that I like to be, which is that, things are the way as they are, and there's nothing I can do to change it and meet the world as it is. But in meeting the world as it is, we can start to see things more clearly. We can start to make shifts. And, you outlined at the start of the conversation on this, you drew this root cause map for us, and how so many of the problems really lie in the faulty stories that we have about what's a life well spent, what's a quality of life, and how we might start to, make shifts to that. And you shared so beautifully as well how you've, walked this unplanned life, as I've heard you describe it as well. And perhaps a reminder as well that, even at different stages in life, we can be open for all kinds of changes to happen, or perhaps move industries or move disciplines or combine everything all together. Yeah, like I said, there's many, many parts in this forest that I would have loved to, continue
Yeah.
walking, but perhaps the sun is setting, or it will set soon. It is already set here in Taipei. I know you're in Canada, and I think you have a full day ahead to keep walking. I will certainly link a lot of what you referenced in the show notes, books that you're involved, projects that you're involved, and, allow people to dive deeper into the work that you're doing. And perhaps that will also allow, new threads and new connections to emerge. And that's certainly my hope with the podcast as well, is that, we can start to share this kinds of work, these kinds of messaging in mainstream spaces. And I say mainstream, I really mean, social media and, other podcast networks. And yeah, find this solidarity, find this community. I think that's what I also heard and really take strongly from your message on how we may start to build a light forest world where we live more connected to the forest, allowing our intuitive mind to play in balance with our rational mind, and start to build a world. Well, I wouldn't even start to do anything. The world will, if as Krishnamurti said, the world will start to reflect who we are back at us. So thank you so much, Naresh. Thank you for joining.
Well, thank you, Dev. And let me just say in closing that when I meet people like yourself, younger people who are engaged in this kind of work and thinking, I am really energized and delighted. So people like yourself and my colleague in India, Devesh Gupta, and the other younger people, I think this is really augur well for the future. One of the things we didn't get around to talking about is the use of stories as
Mm,
such. But this has itself has been a story. So it sort of exemplifies the way this kind of idea. But we use stories in our work on public policy that really blends the rational and intuitive minds well.
mm,
It's perhaps the best way to
yes,
bring these two things together. So
yes.
all of that is at work. But thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be with you today.
Yes, I realized that, yeah, that was stories was another path that I referred to earlier of like one I wish we could have walked down because I feel like sometimes we have to relearn how we learn about stories. And perhaps these are topics or other, conversations that we can
Indeed,
have
indeed, we
one
can
day
always
and
do an
and schedule along. Yeah, for listeners, thank you for joining and staying with Naresh and I through this conversation. I hope you've picked up nuggets and seeds that you may find useful and interesting to you and in your own life and in your work. This is the Light Forest podcast where I bring change makers from around the world and we can have deep conversations about ourselves, about the state of the world. And I think this conversation has been a great example of that. If you haven't subscribed already, I would love if you could hit that button. It's how we tell the algorithms, it's how we bring some more wisdom into the algorithms, and how we start to grow this forest as well without a larger reading subscriber base. I cannot make this podcast possible over a long time, so everyone's support is really helpful. And see you on the next episode or the next walk in the light forest. Thank you so much.